if you want to be a charismatic adult, you really have to be empathic because you want to see the world through the eyes of your children. And this is why I started asking parents the following questions. I would say, take out a sheet of paper, write down the words you hope your children will use to describe you. What you hope. And then I say, what do you say and do on a regular basis so they're likely to use these words? Some parents have said, I need a glass of wine now.
Welcome to Empowered Kids TV, where we introduce you to the people and ideas to help you take action to create the family of your dreams. Today's guest is one of the leading speakers and authors on the themes of resilience, motivation, and family relationships. During a career that spans over 4 decades, he has presented internationally to thousands of parents, educators, mental health professionals, and business people. The author and co-author of 17 books, including How to Raise Resilient Children, The Power of Resilience, and How to Raise a Self-Disciplined Child, he has appeared on various media platforms, including PBS and Sunburst Communications. For me, our guest today has the capacity to shift our mindset by asking some of the most profound questions about our parenting journey. He weaves in humor as he guides us away from any parenting guilt to redefining what we want for ourselves and what we want for our relationship with our children, all in a way that leads to inspired action. So please, help me to welcome a man who had the pleasure of having his preteen kids review his parenting style live on television and the strength to survive it, Dr. Robert Brooks. Welcome to Empowered Kids TV, Dr. Brooks.
It's a pleasure to be here. You're going to bring up what my kids say about me. They're grown now, but, even if you're an expert in your own home, your children refuse to read your resume.
You know what? I've had several times when my kids have said to me, I wonder what the parents of Empowered Kids TV will think about you right about now. I know exactly what you mean.
It just shows we're human and we learn from these things.
It does indeed. I wanted to jump right in on our conversation on resilience by getting your take on your definition of resilience and why you think it's important.
It's, in one sense, a very complicated concept, but just not to overly simplify it. For me, it's the ability or capacity to bounce back from adversity. Every one of us at times in our lives face challenges and setbacks. And it doesn't mean if you're resilient that you're not going to at times face difficult situations or feel stressed. But for me, resilience means when difficult situations come up, you have the confidence and feel that you're going to be able to deal with them. I've often said in my workshops that resilient people, both children and adults, basically see challenges and setbacks as things to solve, problems to solve, rather than be overwhelmed by.
I love that. From your work, there's one theme that I think, especially when it comes to parenting, that is very clear. And that's, as parents, we have to model what we want to see within our kids. So if we're not resilient as parents, is it possible to raise resilient kids?
That's a wonderful question. You know, after writing a couple of books about resilience in children, I cannot tell you how many parents and teachers and other caregivers said the exact question you just raised. Can you raise resilient kids if you're feeling not very resilient? The quick answer is it's much more difficult, which actually led me to write a book about resilience in adults, because we do serve as models. In my workshops, I'll often ask parents, if you make a mistake, if something doesn't go right, how do you handle it? And then I add, if your kids were observing and I interviewed them, how would they say you're handling it? And one mother once said, I won't let you near my kids to ask that question. But, you know, as much as we kid about, this, we do have to look at how we model anything, because, you know, as we'll get into, part of my view of resilience is having kids be more compassionate, self-disciplined. So if we're not modeling that, then we're really not, walking the walk, as we often say. why your question is important to me is, over the years, many children and adolescents I've seen in therapy, I also work very closely, of course, with the parents, because they have to find more effective ways of coping there. So the other thing your question brought up is sometimes parents say, even though it may seem like a funny question, okay, if I don't model it, how important am I to my child? And I say, you are very important. You're the first models they have, and you should never minimize that. I love parents of teenagers who say they never seem to listen to me. I said, they're watching and listening to you much more than they will acknowledge, at that point. So your question invites my recommendation that we have to also take care of ourselves and find effective ways of coping so that we can model those for our children.
Let's start there. Let's start with the parent who's looking at this and go, okay, I'm not really very resilient. I know it's an area I have to improve on. Can we talk about some key areas of resilience that we should be focused on in our own lives as adults?
Sure. When I started to get interested in resilience, because as a psychologist, I was originally trained to look at what's wrong with people and, quotes, to fix things. And over the years, given a number of experiences I had both as a professional and in my personal life, I started to really say, maybe it's more important to ask this question: how does a resilient child or adult see the world differently from one who is not? How do they see themselves differently? And this led me to basically look at what is the mindset of a resilient person and what are their behaviors. And in my books, I talk about a resilient, mindset. And I list certain characteristics of a resilient mindset. One is something I mentioned before. Resilient people have developed really effective problem-solving skills. They can sit back, they can analyze a problem, and they could certainly move forward. And as I go over this, all of these qualities are what we want to see in our children. Resilient people also know that at times they're going to make mistakes. They're going to be setbacks. So they feel mistakes are experiences from which to learn. So one of the things I do, when I work with parents or my adult patients is to say, in one sense, anticipate setbacks, but what is very important, anticipate how you are going to cope with them. So that's certainly another quality. One thing that I focused a great deal in my writings about is, for me, a basic quality of feeling resilient is when you feel you're making a difference in the life of other people, because this brings a sense of purpose and meaning. It's interesting, years ago when I wrote a book about school climate, I asked 1,500 adults to fill out an anonymous questionnaire. Now I probably have about 3,000. What was one of your best memories of school? Something an adult said or did that boosted your dignity and your motivation. One of the most frequent memories, positive memories, when you were asked to help out. Like, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straw. I remember this. So what I say to people, even if they're feeling somewhat depressed and anxious, see if there's something you can do. You're probably doing it anyway, just in raising children, but even outside the family, to volunteer for a week here or there. I talk a great deal about charitable, charitable families. So, the whole issue of problem solving, the whole issue which ties to it of self-discipline, not overreacting to things, the issue of learning how to deal with mistakes, the really importance of what I say I call contributory or charitable activities. And then, just to mention one more for now, when I see people who are not feeling very resilient, often their mindset is they never do anything very effectively. So back in the 1980s, I can't believe how long ago that was now, I started saying we really have to focus on our strengths. And I coined the term or metaphor, we all have islands of competence. We all have areas of strength. So whenever I'm working with someone, even if they're not feeling very good, I certainly don't deny in any way their problems. I focus on the problems, but I also will say, what do you see as your beauty, your interests, your islands of competence? And some people are not sure. And so I will say then this, we have to figure this out. The same thing if we translate it to kids. I realized as I look back at the beginning of my career, parents would come in to see me about a child, their child who has problems. I spend the first 2 hours just discussing the problems. Looking back, I created more of a negative atmosphere. And now, whenever I meet with people in my clinical practice or I give workshops, I will especially my clinical practice, will say after about 10 minutes or 15 minutes of hearing about a child's problems, because the parents came in to discuss problems with me, I'll say, let's just pause. What I would love to hear is what you see as your son or daughter's beauty. Just, these are the words I use, their strengths, their islands of competence. And there's a school principal who was so taken by this that he developed just a simple form. It's the student's name. What are the student's islands of competence? List as many as you can. And then this is just lovely. How are we using these islands of competence in the school to help the student feel more dignified? What it does is it changes a mindset. It doesn't minimize the negative feelings or the problems, but it says, unless you can really focus also on beauty and strengths, you're going to go, you're going to be in a very dark hole there. But we have to do it for ourselves. In psychology now, the very big concept, self-compassion, where you learn also to be compassionate towards yourself. Sometimes people will say one exercise is to say, if your friend had these problems, how would you discuss it with them? Would you say to them, it's terrible to have these problems on? Or would you be more compassionate? Well, be more compassionate to yourself. That was a long answer to your question, but it really triggered a lot.
That's fine. You've touched on quite a few things. There's some that I'd like to dive deeper in. So you're talking about self-compassion. And within your book, you talk about the negative scripts that run in our mind and the difference between people that are resilient and the people that probably struggle with resilience and how to use that negative script. Can we touch on that?
Sure. I always feel there are scripts we have. Like I've sometimes had parents say, I swore I would never say this to my own kids because I didn't like it when my mother or father said it to me. We don't even sometimes realize it. Matter of fact, sometimes when I've seen a family in therapy, there'll be the mother, father say, and a couple of the kids. Sometimes just when the mother is about to say something or the father, I'll turn to the kids and say, do you know what he or she is going to, say? And they do. We're so predictable, in that way. Some scripts are wonderful. If I meet every morning, family gets up, says, I love you, and treat each other very nicely, don't change it. You may wonder what's going on, but don't change it. But some scripts, people are not even as aware of it, Nicole. Some scripts are very self-defeating. Scripts like, I will never get better, or I'm a terrible parent, or my child will never get better, very negative scripts. And then you follow them, or you say the same thing over and over again, even if it doesn't work. So one of the things is in trying to help my, patients to see the power of scripts, I will often say, and this is why in several of my books I wrote, we are the authors of our own lives. Now, what I meant by this is there are things that happen in our lives we're in one sense not the authors, but what we are the authors of is how we respond to events in our lives. I call it personal control. Let's take control of what we have control over. So what I love to do is sometimes, and it doesn't have to be in therapy, people could do this at home, is if you were to now, you're the author and to write a new script, what would it look like? Again, some people have trouble at first even contemplating what a new script would be. What might it look like? And then in therapy, if I'm meeting with a person on a regular basis, we look at that script. And then I say, let's just try to change it slowly. I always tell people, don't try to have major makeovers because they're doomed for failure.
Yes.
Let's just change one thing. Like when you come home from work, say hello to your family instead of just, whatever. Some of the smallest things. Some are much bigger things. Some involve really, especially with some of my adult patients, changing their relationship with their parents. They may be 40 and their parents may be in their 70s. So I find that if people have a certain image or metaphor like scripts, it really helps them to go forward. You know, it really gets them to think about, okay, what would the script be now? How might I say something differently? What's one thing I could change? Like from, I can't exercise because, you know, I'm just not feeling good, to, you know what, but I can walk around the block. That's my new script. One man, though, who had never jogged before, said, I'll start running 5 miles. I said, 5 miles? It took me months to go to 5 miles, you know, kind of thing. And sometimes that's why I love my work. Sometimes when people, you know, if I go over review cases, and of course they're always disguised, some people say, people really, you have to talk to them that way. I say, when you get entrenched in a certain way, in a certain outlook, in a certain negative mindset, one is, some people don't even realize their mindset. They just, this is the reality. I mean, which it is reality, but they think they cannot change. So we start to look at that. So I always say, what are those scripts you would like to change? What are some small steps you can take? Anticipate that there may be setbacks. How are you going to handle these setbacks? And so it almost is like we're rewriting the script of our lives.
I love that. And that leads us into another one of the principles that I want to dive deeper, and that's
Sure.
the concept of being stress hardy people.
Yes.
Can you touch on that for us a bit?
Yes, I didn't coin the term. There was a psychologist, Suzanne Cabasa, who coined the term, but it was her work paralleled the work I was doing, because she basically asked, why is it people say working in the same work environment, why is it that some are more stressed and less stressed? And the quick answer, there are a couple of quick answers. One is, we know from research on child development that from birth, every child's temperament is different. And from birth, some kids are going to experience stress more easily than others. It doesn't mean we can't help them to deal with stress, but they will. The other is the environment we grow up in. Some kids grow up, unfortunately, in environments where they never see problems solved. Getting back to we serve as models, there's always tension. Other kids, they're certainly going to see their parents argue at times, but they always then see some resolution, you know, in that regard. So what Suzanne Cabasa basically said was, how does a stress-hardy person see the world differently or themselves differently than one who's not stressed? I was asking it, how does a resilient person see the world differently? And she found there were actually 3 areas which just dovetailed or resonated with my own work. She found that one thing is, and she was really looking at, in the workplace. I give a lot of workshops for teachers. She did work with educators. One was the notion of commitment. We should never forget why we do what we do, whether it's as a parent or when I speak to teachers, to remember the lifelong impact you can have. Because when you get stressed or pressured, sometimes you forget what your purpose is and what the meaning is. And I've actually, you know, worked with principal and teachers where I'll have teachers go around the room and say, why did you become a teacher? What? And many will say, it almost feels funny discussing this because they've never discussed it in front of, you know, staff, but it's very important. So one thing had to do with, never forget why you became a mother, why you became a father, what were your hopes, what were your dreams, why did you do this? Because, you know, in terms of purpose and meaning and commitment, it's often when we've had a tragedy in our life that one way we deal with the stress and grief is to make meaning of it. So like the group Mothers Against Drunk Drivers started in the United States when a couple of mothers lost daughters to drunk driving, and they wanted to at least say, I've got to make some sense and meaning out of this. So one was commitment. I call it the 3 C's. And the second is challenge. And basically, we've heard that before. Stress-hardy people just expect there to be changes and obstacles and whatever. So they see these as opportunities to learn rather than feel defeated by. It's very similar to when I talk about, you know, mistakes in problem solving. So a difficult situation arises. They say, what can I learn from this? When I work with teachers, I say, you can almost anticipate that not every kid is going to come in and say, I've waited all my life to be, you know, your student. What are you going to do if the kid doesn't want to do the work or whatever? See it as a challenge. See it as an opportunity to learn how to reach all children. I work with many parents who have children with special needs. They were not anticipating this, but then what can we learn? How can you help your child? Because you see, if your mindset is when challenges, oh my God, another setback, another this, you can't be a good problem solver. So anticipate this. And the third C, she called control, but some people misunderstood that as if you're trying to control someone else. So that's why in my writings, I talk about personal control. And excuse me, it's what I alluded to before. Basically, stress hardy or resilient people focus on what they have control over. It's almost like the serenity prayer. And don't waste time what they have no control over. I mean, I once had a couple come in, I do couples therapy as well. And I said, what will help your marriage? And I don't even know if the wife truly appreciated what she said. She looked at me, she looked at her husband, looked back at me and said, I'd be in a good marriage if I wasn't married to him. But that's not going to help anyone, you know. And what I always say is, you know, we have control over only one person in our life. And sometimes we may not even feel it. It's ourselves. And, you know, when our kids are born, we think we're going to have some control. We're going to have influence on them.
Short time.
Yeah. So anyway, the stress hardiness of the commitment, the seeing things as a challenge, and looking at what you have control over are also very important qualities of what I include under a resilient mindset.
I love the personal control because I think a lot of parents get stuck in the mode of you are making me so mad.
Yes.
And I'm yelling because you didn't listen. And really giving up our personal power to people outside of ourselves.
Exactly.
How we feel. And that leads me into the last one I want to take a deep dive in, and that's self-discipline. Because a lot of times I think as parents, we expect our kids to have more self-discipline than we're willing to have as the adults. So I just wanted to touch on what you mean by self-discipline and why it's important for building resilience.
Yeah, it's so interesting because after writing a couple of books about resilience in kids, and self-discipline was a major part, because I started saying you can't be resilient and good problem solver if you lack self-discipline, where you act, you know, before you think, which actually led me to research and write a book, you know, raising a self-disciplined child. It wasn't called being a good disciplinarian. It was called raising a self-disciplined child. Although we should remember, I always tell people, you know, when for some people, if they think, if they said, oh, you believe in discipline? I said, no child comes into the world with self-discipline. But what I believe is we have to remember the word discipline stems from the word disciple. It's a teaching process. It's not a process of humiliation. Okay. So why is it so important? You know, in one sense, it may seem obvious, but it impacts on almost everything in, you know, in life. As I said, no child comes into the world with self-discipline, being able to, you know, think before they act. So it impacts on your relationships with others, how you speak with others, what you say to others. So it impacts, you know, certainly on relationships. It impacts on learning. You know, I've worked with kids who really have very poor self-discipline, and they cannot really stop and think about what they're doing, you know, in terms of their work or learning. It impacts in adults on their workplace. You know, one man who lacked self-discipline I saw in therapy, if he didn't like something his boss said, he told off the boss. And he was fired a couple of times. And I said to him, this, you know, you may think this, but you have to have the discipline. It sounds so obvious. I sound so brilliant, you know, here, but it sounds so obvious. So actually, that's what led to writing just a separate book on how to discipline children in our homes and schools in ways where they will become, I call, more respectful and responsible and resilient rather than more angry and resentful. And there are, just to follow up also on the question, there's been research to show there are 4 main parenting discipline styles. And I'll just quickly go over it in terms of, listen, one is the authoritarian. They're the ones who say, you do it because I'm your mother and father. By the way, we all can get to that point, all right? They often show very little love, but what they rob the child of, and often it's done in a great deal of anger, what they rob the child of is learning to problem solve, looking at what the child did, thinking about the consequences. Then there's the laissez-faire. They're the parents, they may love their kid, but they are afraid if they set limits, the kid may not like them. So when I work with some parents like this, finally they set a reasonable limit. And, these kids are very bright. They'll say, you don't love me. Because if you love me, you wouldn't ask me to, go to bed by so-and-so, or set these limits. And some parents then give in. And I say, these kids, longitudinal studies have been done. These kids can grow up very entitled. The authoritarian kid growing up in an authoritarian home can grow up, just very angry. Then they had, actually the worst outcome was what they call the neglectful. They basically just neglected the child. The one we should all strive for sounds like authoritarian, but it's close to authoritative. Those are the parents who give a great deal of love, but they don't get into these long negotiations with kids. Very clear-cut goals. They do not humiliate children, and they're constantly trying, the best way to say it is, for the child to take ownership for their behavior, not by demeaning children, but they want children to see the consequences of the behavior. So an example I sometimes use is kids take out toys in a family room, and they're supposed to put it back. They don't. The authoritarian parent basically might spank the kid or yell or scream. The laissez-faire parent goes, picks it up themselves. The neglectful parent doesn't even notice. But the authoritative parent, and I don't want to overly simplify this, will say to the child, yesterday I asked you to put the toys away, you didn't. Now it's going to be your choice. See, they word it like this. If you don't put your toys away today, you will not have them to play with tomorrow. Now, I'm not saying any of this is easy, because we've all said things which after we said, was that the best form of discipline? But it's important to have certain guidelines, because the ones who are most resilient grow up in the homes of the authoritative parent, because there's also a lot of love. The other thing the authoritative parent does, as the child gets older into their teen years, as they can handle it, of course, they also give them more responsibility, more choices. And this is what leads to self-discipline. Self-discipline is ownership, for your own behavior. And that's what you want to see develop.
I love that. And I love the conversation about retaining kids' dignity. Because a lot of the times we think because we're bigger and we're in charge that we could speak to kids in a way that doesn't uphold their dignity or isn't as respectful as we would speak to another adult. So I absolutely love that. And I think, so we've given parents sort of a guide of what they need to look at within themselves. And now I'd like us to twist our view in terms of who do we have to be and what our interactions need to look like if we are going to raise resilient kids ourselves. And there's one sort of main sort of theme that runs through your work with regards to that. And it's that kids need at least one adult that would be a charismatic adult in their life. Can we touch on that?
Sure. It's one of my favorite topics. When psychologists started to interview adults who had overcome adversity and now were doing relatively well in life, with good relationships, decent jobs, they asked, these adults, they said, we could have never predicted based on what you experienced growing up that you would be as hopeful or as optimistic or as accomplished as you are. What do you think was the most important thing in your childhood or adolescence to help you overcome adversity? In every study that was done, Nicole, the first answer was always the same. It sounded so simple, but there was at least one person along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. I mean, hopefully it's the parents, but actually in an article I'm going to mention now, there's a psychologist, Julius Siegel. He died a few years ago, wonderful psychologist in the Washington, D.C. area. In a very brief article, he called that one adult a charismatic adult in a child's life. Some people are taken by the word charismatic, but I said, if you're not crazy about that word, just think of this definition. An adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. I love that, gathers strength. And just as a sidebar, we as adults need charismatic adults in our life. It never stops. We all need people from whom we gather strength. And when he wrote that, then of course the question is, what do you do to become a charismatic adult? Because I love in my workshops, people say, okay, I want to be a charismatic adult. What do I say? No, yeah, that's exactly it. So, and that's where we get into, unconditional love, helping kids solve problems, helping them feel dignified, giving them opportunities to help others. But a very important quality I want to get into, excuse me, which has to do with, if you want to be a charismatic adult, you really have to be empathic, because you want to see the world through the eyes of your children. And this is why I started asking parents the following questions. I would say, take out a sheet of paper, write down the words you hope your children will use to describe you. What you hope. And then I say, what do you say and do on a regular basis so they're likely to use these words? Some parents have said, I need a glass of wine now. And then I say, what words do you think they will use? I've actually had parents ask their kids this. I do the same thing, by the way, with teachers. Or when I work in the business world, I'll ask business managers, leaders, how would you like your employees to describe you? And it gets a little dicey in marital therapy on that. But it's a very powerful thing, because Daniel Goleman, a psychologist, wrote a book, Emotional Intelligence, and some follow-up books. And he said, in terms of emotional intelligence, which he called EQ, a very important component is empathy. And some people have a more difficult time being empathic than others. But it really gets us to think about, when we say this, how does the other person experience it? And again, for some people that is more difficult. They had no models, unfortunately, who were empathic. Others grew up in homes where parents really did attempt to see the world through their eyes. And it's a basic quality to be a charismatic adult.
I love it. I want to touch on one of the things that you talk about in terms of being a charismatic adult, and it relates to empathy. And you talk about never minimizing or denying a child's feelings. And I think this is one we can really be guilty of as parents.
Well, sometimes even loving parents, you want to protect your children, but you don't validate what they say. So just to give you, an example, I was seeing a family with a teenage girl who was depressed. Now, in the very first meeting, the girl comes in and she's very open. She says, I've really been feeling depressed lately. And the mother, just out of her own anxiety, wanting to be a good mother, jumps in and says, but there's no reason for you to be depressed. We love you. You live in a nice home. And the girl didn't want to say another word. No one wants to be told how they should feel. So instead, it could be very, some people, what should the mothers? Mothers should say, I'm really glad you can let us know how you feel. And if they're in a therapy office, you can say, that's one of the reasons we're here. It's like, after one of my talks about raising resilient children, a mother, in the audience said, I'm really perplexed by this. I have a 9-year-old son. And he often says he's ugly and this and this, and no one wants to hear that. And I said, well, how do you handle it? She said to him, no, you're not. And I said, well, how does he respond? And she said, he seems to get angry. And I'm trying to be a loving mother. So I told her this true story. When I was first in training, I was a postdoctoral fellow. And what happened was, I had, just like her son, a 9-year-old boy in therapy. One of the first sessions, he says to me, Dr. Brooks, I really, feel ugly and this, just like her son. And I said to him, oh, but you're not. And he said to me, this was incredible. He said, do you listen to people? And what he was trying to say was, I'm telling you I'm ugly. You're saying that. So I learned, I said, I was trying to be, just reassure him. But being what they call, really believing in positive psychology doesn't mean you deny the negative feelings. You validate them. And this is true in any situation. It's true if, a kid is angry and a parent says, well, you shouldn't be angry. Instead, you could say, I can see you're angry. Or yesterday I was giving a workshop and we got into the issue when kids say it's not fair. And I said, it's always interesting to me. Kids will always say that. And some parents then get into 2-hour debate about why things are fair. Okay. Or I love this one. You think things are not fair now? Wait till you get to the real world, whatever that is. So people say, what do you say? I said, the best thing to say is, say to your child, I'm really glad you could tell me you think things are not fair. I want to discuss this with you. I may not be able to change a lot, but I will want to hear what you have to say, and let's see if there is something we could do. I talk a lot about empathic communication. Ask yourself, what is it you want to accomplish, but are you saying or doing it in a way where the other person will be most receptive to hearing you? Whether it's your children, it could be a colleague, it could be a spouse, it's in any relationship. And I really learned this the hard way, like that 9-year-old philosopher. Boy, I mean, he was right when he said, do you listen to people? I wasn't listening to him. And I always say validation does not mean you agree. It means you're attempting to show you understand that. Because you have to keep in mind, what do you want the person to hear and to learn from you? And if they shut you down like that happened with that girl in therapy who said, I'm depressed, and the mother said, no reason for you to be, you know, at least she was willing to come back the next week, and mother learned a little to validate, not to deny someone's feelings.
We talked earlier on about Island of Competence. And what I love, you have a few examples from your work where instead of focusing on the behavior that might seem negative of kids, we twist the focus to look at the child's island of competence, and really the child really seems to grow and flourish because now we're lifting them up. Can we talk about that?
I'll tell you, the very first time I used it was I was asked to consult on and see in therapy a 10-year-old boy who was a very angry boy. The school didn't know what to do. He would come in every day and hit other kids, so he's constantly being disciplined. And he would, and one of the new behaviors, the principal told me, if he didn't come in to hit kids, he'd get off the bus and hide behind the bushes of the school. So this is the scene. So I'm seeing him. It's the first session, my first session, and this is going to be one of the first times I'm going to actually ask kids first what they like to do, you know, what their on the competence is, rather than, you know, what the problem is. He didn't give me a chance. He comes in and yells, 10 years old, and I'll keep this clean, but there were a few He says, I know why I'm seeing you. And he screams at me, why? I hide behind the bushes of the school, and just like this. What do you think you're going to do about it? I remember saying to myself, what am I going to do? Get into a debate about bushes versus schools? And I said, you know, I was going to ask him his strengths. I'll tell you, I'm an optimistic person, but I didn't really even know if this was going to work. I said to him, you know, I'm really interested. What do you think you do that's pretty good, that you really like doing? If there are gods of therapy, they were in my office that day, because he said, I love to take care of my pet dog. I say, I know very little about taking care of pets. Could you talk to me about it? He spoke almost nonstop for the next 45 minutes. It was almost comical. At the end, I had another patient waiting. I said, we really have to stop now. He looks at me and says, good session, doc. Yeah, he spoke the whole time. I called the principal. I said, do you have a pet monitor in your school? He said, what is it? I said, if you have to ask what it is, you don't have it. You really need it. I explained it to him. The next day, the principal calls me. He's laughing hysterically. He said, Bob, I like this strength-based approach. I just had one of the greatest meetings. The kid knew I was going to speak to the principal. And I said to this kid, yesterday, a class got a new pet rabbit. That was true, purely coincidentally. And the principal said, I really try to make it so genuine, and which he was really getting into. He said, I realized the principal should know how many pets there are in the school. I walked around this morning, there are at least a dozen pets. I know each class takes care of their own pet, but I need at least one person to make sure they're all well taken care of. I would like you to become the first pet monitor of the school. And he did something I didn't. He made actually a union card. It's a pet monitor. The only one in the country, but he made it. The kid was funny. The next session I saw him, he throws his union card on my desk. He says, Brooks, be careful, I'm union now. Well, what was a pet monitor? It was his job to come in early every morning, which his parents were very happy to bring him early, to take care of the pet rabbit. Soon he's taking care of other pets. Soon this wonderful, charismatic teacher says, I've checked every book in the school library. There's not one good book on taking care of pets. You should write a book, a little book. And his immediate knee-jerk reaction is, I can't write. See, he was to tell me in therapy, one of the reasons he used to hit kids is that he'd rather be sent to the principal's office than have to be in the classroom where he felt like a dummy. So he writes this little book. By the end of the year, he lectured in every classroom in that building. And he never hit another kid again or hid behind the bushes. And what I always say is he had a wonderful teacher and principal who were willing to look beyond his behavior, try to understand it, be empathic, and to give him an opportunity to shine, to show his islands of competence. Plus, what we said before, he had now a purpose at the school. It's not always going to work that effectively, but I'll tell you, even with, I was principal for several years of a school in a locked door unit of a psychiatric hospital. And I saw firsthand when you look beyond what the kid's diagnosis was and found opportunities for them to shine, to help others, to really find, identify, and display their islands of competence, the negative behavior really decreased markedly.
I love it. There's one more I want to dive in, and that you talk about know your kid. And I want to talk about this because I think in my early years as a parent, I got into the habit of, if you weren't like me, I was going to fix you. Because clearly I'm awesome and you need to be like me. So I just want to touch on know your kid and the importance of it for parents as they try to be charismatic adults.
Very powerful. Actually, Know Your Child was based on a book written by a husband and wife psychiatry team, Chess and Thomas. They, way back, I think it was back in the 50s, they decided to look at the question, how different are kids at birth? And so they studied hundreds and hundreds of infants, and they came to this amazing conclusion, right? Every child is different at birth. But what made them so well known in the field of child development is they said there are major temperamental differences, and there were like 8 different categories. And they said within reason, there were 3 kinds of kids who come into the world based on their temperament. And I think why they call the book Know Your Child is that if you don't know the temperament of your child, even well-meaning parents may say or do things, not out of malevolence, but because they don't understand their child, that actually could hurt their child's development. And from my vantage point, hurt the child from becoming resilient. One they call the easy child. That's the kid in my workshops. I say, from the moment they're born, they sort of look up to you as if to say, don't you worry, I'm going to make you feel like the best parent to ever walk the earth. Those are the kids you can't wait to have school conferences about them. You can't wait to bring them, to
show them all.
Parents. Yeah. Then they discussed a kid who I think sometimes we do a disservice. They said there are a number of children who are slow to warm up or shy or cautious. I don't know if they actually use the word shy, but others have. These are the kids who, when they're younger, someone new comes into the house, they always hide behind you. These are the kids you have to say, when your grandparents come over, would you please smile at them and say hello? They're not doing it on purpose. It takes them time. And I was once seeing a 7-year-old in therapy who, again, the mother and father well-meaning, but when a shy kid, when she came home from school every day, the first thing the mother said is, did you speak to anyone at school today? Because if you don't speak to anyone, you're not going to have any friends. And the girl in therapy said, don't you know if I could speak to someone, I would. She wasn't doing it on purpose. But instead, what I say to parents, use problem solving. I know it's not easy for you to make friends. Let's think of ways we may solve it. You don't want your child, as one kid said to me, a 10-year-old boy once, I wish my parents, were basically were lawyers and basically defended me rather than prosecuted me. And so they talk about that. You're not doing anything wrong as a parent. This is an inborn temperament. And then the third child they called the difficult child. And this is a child from birth. Parents have described them differently. So many have hypersensitivities. They're the ones who say, I can't stand the label on my shirt. They're hypersensitive to sound. It's hard to please them. And what I say is, if parents are not aware of this, sometimes parents will get angry. They'll get angry at themselves. They'll get angry at their children. Because some parents have said, can you help difficult children? I said, yes, you can. If you know, if you assume they're not doing this on purpose, this is who they are. They see the world in polarities. In one article I said, based on what parents' descriptions, they seem insatiable. You cannot please them. Where also the problem comes in, there's a lovely concept called goodness of fit. That's the fit between the parent's temperament and style and the child's. And, if parents were very good in school and their kid has learning problems, it's more difficult. But sometimes if a parent is shy. You think if they had a shy kid, they'd be more empathic. But I've worked with parents where they said, I don't want my kid to be like me. So they pressure the kid. As a parent, we have to accommodate more to our child's style than they're going to accommodate to ours, at least, when they're kids. And we have to really help them and understand, this. And it's very important because temperament does play a large role in a child's development, how they act, how we react to them, and then how they react back.
There's just one more thing, because I'm mindful of our time now, that I wanted to
Okay.
and this, I'm going to use my own experience, because I realized over the last couple of days. So when I started my parenting journey, I started from a very, very disconnected place. I thought I was doing the right thing. I went to the library and I read all the books, and they all taught me all the super nanny principles of which corner of the house to put my kids in. And it's taken me a while to move my family from there. But what I've recognized is that when it comes to mistakes in my family, we're very open to physical mistakes. So you drop a glass, or you tripped over. But I think where we have work to do still as a family is to allow my kids to feel safe for making emotional mistakes, not managing their anger or their fears in the way that they probably would have liked to. So I just wanted to touch on that, because you mentioned that part of being a charismatic adult is allowing space for kids to make mistakes and to learn from it. Do you have any tips on what we can do to really develop that area within our family?
Sure. First of all, I'm glad you handle physical mistakes, because some kids drop something and parent yells, I told you if you don't pay close attention, and they go on and on. What you're bringing up, though, is very interesting in terms of emotionally the different feelings kids have, and it really ties to a few things we've talked about. So I'm glad you brought this up. I think it's very fun, and I'm not saying this is easy, because it's so easy for me to say, our kid gets angry. For us to say, I can see you're angry, but just by screaming and yelling is not going to lead to, what you may want. Let's say a kid is angry about not getting something. Or that, that boy who said he felt ugly and depressed. I could see you depressed, and we really have to figure out what may be of help here. I often feel that if we could put in terms of we have to figure out, it also says to the child, we're going to work on this together. Even certain words can bring a parent and a kid together. I think any of the children's fantasies or worries or whatever, we should never minimize. If a kid is really scared of different things, I always find it's helpful to say, I could see you're scared. A lot of kids are scared. We have to be truthful, but even normalizing it to say it's not just you, and we'll figure out what may be of help. It's amazing how some kids will come up with the solutions. There was one boy who had trouble going to bed. I think he was all of like 4 years old. And his parents all of a sudden thought he was just this oppositional kid because he'd get out of bed and scream and yell. I met him and I immediately asked, if he had nightmares, and he had really terrible nightmares. And that's why he didn't want to go to bed, and he acted up, and his parents saw it one way. They didn't, but I asked him what he thought would help. There are some people who work in problem solving who say, if you give even a 4-year-old an opportunity, they may tell you, well, this is what he said. He wanted a photo of his parents right by his bed, so if he got scared, he could see it. Yeah, and he's only 4, and a nightlight. And he said he once asked for a nightlight, maybe a month ago, but his parents thought it would keep him from going to sleep. Obviously, it was very helpful. Anyway, after he got the nightlight, after he got the photo, after instead of yelling at him if he was having trouble going to sleep, they comforted him, the problem disappeared. I wasn't a miracle worker there, but it was listening to the kids. So it's not always easy. Sometimes parents, we want to jump in, we want to reassure, or we get angry or whatever. But I think if we're empathic, we have to say, what is our child really communicating? And how do I say things where the child doesn't feel I'm judging them or accusing them in any way, but really want to work with them to solve this problem?
I love that. There's one question, and sometimes I think you ask some profound questions that kind of hit me
Uh-oh.
really hard.
Yeah.
When you talked about a charismatic adult, there's one question that I now ask myself when I get to the end of the day, and I ask myself, did my kids gather strength from me today?
Yeah.
And I
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah. I ask that a lot in my workshop. It's with teachers. I say at the end of the day, ask this: did every child in my class have they gathered strength from me? I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and some days they're not. I say to parents, did my child gather strength from me? When my older son, who's very successful today, did no work in school for 4 years, and the first thing I would say to him is, did you do your homework? When I got home, which really caused a lot of tension right away, I had to honestly say that he's not gathering strength from me.
Mm,
You know, he's a great kid. Why don't you tell me you love him and things,
mm,
like this? And it's in any situation. I've said it even to business leaders or, to heads of certain groups. Have the people who work with you gathered strength from you?
mm,
And some days they're not, but at least I always feel like in my books, I try to say, consider this or reflect on this. It's just like in my workshops, I'll say, I'm going to bring up a lot of information today, and it's really for you to reflect upon. I say, I know some of the best workshops I ever attended were ones where I didn't say a word, but I couldn't stop thinking about them and reflecting on them. So that's why, I raise questions like these, and I'm very honest about it. Sometimes
they're
my
hard.
answers to myself are not like very good, but then I have to say, then you have to change personal control. And especially why would you ask a kid for 4 straight years if he did his homework when it doesn't work? What do you expect? You have to think about another approach, but subtly or not so subtly as parents, sometimes we think if we give the same message for 6 years, finally our kid's going to wake up and say, I've seen the light. This does not happen, in that regard. So it's just important. What can we do differently? But to reflect on that, we want to be a charismatic adult. What can we do, and what do we have to change?
Dr. Brooks, tell us where we can find out more about your work online.
Well, probably at my website, which is Dr. Robert Brooks, Dr. Robert Brooks, BROOKS.com, because I also write a monthly article that everything we discussed today, I started writing it, like 20 years ago. So, and I write 10 articles a year. Almost everything we discussed today, they're brief articles. And then, you mentioned several of my books. There's a page there. And there's also some video and audio clips of talks I've given. So that's probably where most of the information, was. Of course, I'm not going to let you speak to my sons, they're grown, but they will say, and certainly not my wife. You're a delightful interviewer, by the way.
Oh, thank you. My very last question was,
Yeah.
what does it mean to you to live an empowered life?
I think it ties to personal control and some of the other things. For me, an empowered life is where you really feel that you are the author of your own life, that you're doing, one of the best ways of saying, you don't look back years later and say, I wish I had done this, this, and this, that you're willing to take some risk, and also for me, an empowered life, why it ties to resilience is within that empowered life, you're also enriching the lives of others. I've been speaking so much more about that compassion and caring and purpose. And I say, like with parents, it's not just lecturing to your kids about being more compassionate. Provide them with opportunities. That's why I talk about being a charitable family, go for walks for hunger, walks for AIDS, through our places of worship to do certain things. So, you get to a certain age, you don't look back and say, I wish I'd done this, this. Because so many of my patients said, I only wish I would have done this and this. I often say it's not too late, but certainly many years may have been missed along the way that, that you could have done certain things you wanted to do.
I love it. Dr. Brooks, thank you so much for joining us and for your amazing body of work that continues to lift us all up higher every month.
Thank you. And I know those people who subscribe to my articles and whatever would love to, whenever this is going to be posted, to see this interview. So you'll let me know.
Yep. So this will get edited. So I think it will be live probably closer to the end of October now, given our schedule.
Sure.
But it gets edited. You have the full video, and then we'll have maybe about 3 or 4 short clips.
Sure.
I'll send you the links to all, but if you also wanted the full video that you can put up on your website, I can send that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
I know, I would love to. I also love to see my oldest son, who didn't do much work in school. He started his own company. He's really into social media. So, you know, I would put it on Facebook, and I would tweet about it and
Is
have
that
links to your
Richard?
books. Yeah, well, you were great.
Oh, thank
And
you.
keep that wonderful smile.
Oh, thank you.
Light up a room. No, I talked yesterday about that. That kid said one of
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Empowered Kids TV. If this is your first time with us, I'd like to ask you 2 favors. First of all, subscribe and support the channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us to continue to bring amazing experts on to answer some of your toughest parenting questions. And 2, remember, it still takes a village. So if you found any value in this episode, be sure to share it with your family and friends. As we always say here at the village, you're just one connection away. With love and gratitude, empower us. Until next time.